All right, welcome into the YouTube channel live stream as we do a little bit of the behind the scenes look as we record the One Giant podcast update for today, the 27th, 28th of April. In these isolated times, it's easy to forget what day of the week, what date of the month it is. That being said, we're going to dive in here in just a second. And of course, you'll be able to see this on YouTube. And you can also go over and listen to the podcast with myself, Adam Arbrecht, as well as Andy Makowitz, as we did our full breakdown. We had that live behind the scenes look here as well. We're going to do some different stuff between YouTube and the podcast, but for right now, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're coming from and what goes on, we'll go ahead and give you this live look in here as we do our update. So first thing, I'll just be switching over to make sure that I get myself rolling on our audio track. And now that's it. We're going to dive in and take a look at some of the news and notes following the draft that just concluded over this past weekend. And welcome back to the One Giant podcast. Without Andy Makowitz, I am Adam Arbrecht, coming to you with all things New York Football Giants, an off-season update following the 2020 NFL Draft. Couple of worthwhile news and notes around this team. We're going to start offensive line related in a couple of different areas, and then touch on a free agent that I know has been on the minds of a lot of Giants fans lately, as we look to continue to fill out this roster through the draft, through the post-draft free agent signings that we've done as well. And then certainly, as you see some cuts happen around the league and some other signings occur, could potentially see some fits for the Giants from a depth perspective. So first and foremost, what we touch on here is the familiar name, and that is Nate Soldier. We know that the Giants addressed a lot of need in the NFL draft. First and foremost, fourth overall pick, Andrew Thomas out of Georgia. Now, you can say pen or pencil, however you want to write him in. He's going to be the starting left tackle for Big Blue in the 2020 NFL season. The reason why the Giants obviously went with him is the high floor may not be the highest ceiling relative to some of the other options at the top of the draft from a tackle perspective, but he played against the highest level competition at college, had all of his reps there at that left tackle position. And again, technically sound, some areas to work and improve on, but the Giants felt very comfortable with the baseline that Andrew Thomas can give them coming in. What that means is Nate Solder, who obviously signed that massive $64 million contract, all of a sudden you feel like, okay, now he's removed out of that left tackle starting job. Originally, when we looked at this offseason, we thought Solder, certainly could get swung over if you followed Andy Makowitz's logic to the right side, have an opportunity to compete with Fleming, who they signed this offseason as well, and maybe get a chance to still have a role on this team. We've highlighted along the way. End of last season, Nick Gates had played very well for this team, and we had the conversation: should he be deserving of an opportunity to compete for the right tackle position? Perhaps that can be the case, but as it stands right now, you think about having Nick Gates as maybe that swing tackle. We saw him play a guard as well, so he offers you depth at a number of positions still. Then you have Fleming. He has experience at left tackle as well, so he's a candidate to be a backup on either side if he's not starting. And then, of course, in addition, the Giants also drafted Pert at the tackle position as well. Feel like he's a little bit of a project, and not in a negative way, just maybe could use that 1 year to really refine himself, get him up to snuff, and then see him take over at the right tackle position the following season. Even if that is to be the case, combining with another player we're going to touch on here in a minute, and that's Lemieux, guard/center, potentially. The Giants really, fleshed out this offensive line, not just from a starting talent, but also from a backup standpoint as well. So when we think about Nate Soldier, who last season, as you'll recall, right? Now let's just make sure we get every one of these categories lined up here. He gave up the second most sacks, the most pressures, and was one of the worst run blockers in the NFL from a rating standpoint. So a lot of lows on Nate Solder's resume there. Even if you were going to swing him around and say he could compete at right tackle, you're talking about Fleming being there, veteran, connected to Jason Garrett, the offensive coordinator. You feel like they're probably at worst on even footing, and you'd like to think that Fleming could be even a little bit better. You still have Nick Gates there, and then as the aforementioned draftee Pert. So now you're talking about a little bit of a logjam here at the tackle position. Even if you disregard left or right, you're still talking about having Thomas, Solder, Fleming, Gates, and Pert. So now 5 players really there for 2 positions. You don't need to have all of them there. Obviously, Gelman restructured Solder's contract, so you're going to take dead money hit were he to be moved on from. But you'd think with the signing of a guy like Fleming and then the way this draft played out that the Giants are moving in the direction of parting ways with Solder. I said this all along. I really didn't want him to be starting at either tackle position, certainly not left. And then even right, I would have preferred that Gates get that opportunity, or now Fleming, now Pert, whoever it may be. Beyond that, it's also now, listen, if you want to keep him on the roster as a veteran presence, I know that he's a very well-liked and respected member of the locker room. At that point, I'm okay with that, right? Dead cap money being considered, all those things, unless you needed to move the cap to be able to create some space for another player, you want to keep him on the roster. Obviously, I'm not going to begrudge Dave Gettleman that. We know, to touch on it, that certainly Solder's had some family concerns there with the health of his child over the last couple of years. So I'm not going to diminish what it may mean for him emotionally, what he may have gone through mentally this last season, certainly. So if you want to keep him on the roster, that's all fine and well. And again, if he wins out a job at right tackle, it just means that he was able to turn things around, and I'd be okay with that. But because of the youth and the depth now, you start to think, how much are you maybe going to be stunting one of these other players if you keep another veteran presence on the line? We change our attention now over to Shane Lemieux. He also came in through the draft, selection 150 in the 2020 NFL draft for the New York Football Giants. And the reason why we talk about him is that we're highlighting the fact that the New York Football Giants did not draft a pure center, right? We thought about the idea that Gates could maybe kick inside for Big Blue and play at that position. We obviously know that Jalapeno trying to recover from his injury. He's obviously not the long-term answer there. You still have Spencer Pulley on this roster, though he was beaten out by Jalapeno. So if you don't want Jalapeno, you shouldn't want Spencer Pulley either. I was up for Gates to maybe kick inside. Now it feels more like what Gates represents is one of the only real depth players on this offensive line from the previous season that the Giants are excited to bring back and have be in the fold, but it also doesn't mean that they want him to necessarily be in a starting position. Previously, though, Shane Lemieux came in and said, what's it going to take in order to get myself from guard to center if that's where the Giants want me to shift to? He said it'll take sweat, but it'll be no sweat. So essentially, he just thinks that the skill set transfers. We highlighted this, and I'll go off screen here for a minute for our friends on YouTube, just to read off of our assessment of him that we had highlighted in the last podcast episode. A 6.17 prospect grade. That's good enough to be a solid backup and developmental into a starter at some point along the way. 6'4", 310 pounds, prototype physical blue-collar guard. Does have the length there to be able to kick inside to the center position. Pushes and sustains well through the block, moves to the second level, and takes on linebackers with strength as well. He resets his hands and re-engages and recovers against moving and shifting assignments on the offensive line. He does have short arms, which lacks lateral movement, and the punch placement can be a little bit erratic in terms of areas he's going to want to work on. Shorter arms, again, always makes sense. You go from outside in terms of where you want to place these players on your line. So him being able to kick inside, I think one of the lines we had too was barrel-chested, which always reminds me of a center, right? That big-bodied figure in the middle of this line. Furthering that discussion around it, in an interview just after the draft, he said, I think I'm an offensive lineman. This is on Tuesday via Zoom call. I'm a football player that plays offensive line. No matter where the coaches want to put me to best help the team, that's where I'm going to go. And that's the kind of answer you obviously want from the player you take at 150 overall. Listen, I think that if you move him inside, do I see him starting immediately? That's kind of the question here, right? It's a question about a lot of these players. We highlighted Pert there, and how long do they think the development process will take for him? Lemieux at guard, obviously you have Zeitler there currently on the right side, but this is the last year of his contract. Left side with a scheme shift, we think that Hernandez should be coming into his own this season, now with Thomas alongside him on the left. So, there really is an opening here for potentially Lemieux to maybe end up being the guard of the future on the right side. If he kicks into center, then I can envision Gates potentially shuffling around this line, being a solid backup, and then getting earmarked as possibly the starting guard on the right side going into the following year. So a lot of flexibility here, and the importance that Gettleman placed on revamping this offensive line and getting it back to a place where you can be looking at it confidently, not just from a starter standpoint, but also from the backup position as well. I'm excited about Lemieux. I think that they will kick him inside. I think they'll ask him to try to develop that skill set at the center position, and if he does so successfully, then I think you can be looking at going into, if not this season, the following year, he can be your starting center, which will still leave the question mark of where do you go for this one season or maybe half a season while he gets himself fully transitioned. But remember, when you're talking about Jalapillo, Spencer Pulley, these are not guys that really are a ringing endorsement or fill you with confidence. So if there's going to be growing pains, this is the risk reward here, right? Throw Thomas into the fire at left tackle. I think you'll be pretty happy with the results even early on there. Now, if you're going to put Purdon on the right side, growing pains, risking Daniel Jones, risking the rushing attack for Saquon Barkley, likewise, maybe at center, could Lemieux use a little bit of time to make sure that he's 100% ready to go? And I think that that's the mentality that Dave Gettleman is taking. But I also know for a fact, I can't say for a fact, but all indications is that when you get into camp, Joe Judge is going to give everyone across this roster an opportunity to compete and win starting jobs, to create that hierarchy on the depth chart. So if Lemieux can transition, shows that he is the most viable option there at center and has the highest upside going forward, being a young rookie, then Joe Judge is going to give him that chance. And if you're talking about Daniel Jones in his second year, if you like the skill set that Lemieux brings, you might as well create that tandem now so they just continue to build and get better together as they both progress through their young careers. The final note to mention here, and that is going to be, as we said, an old friend that we're so familiar with and really maybe thought was not going to have an opportunity to come back to this roster, and that's Marcus Golden. Listen, we highlighted again this last episode. I liked what the Giants did from a linebacker standpoint. I think they upgraded in the free agency class. Might have been moderate upgrades, but I think Blake Martinez, you brought in Fackrell, you like that. You have Ryan Connolly coming back from his injury, assuming that he can be healthy. That's another viable asset there as well. Existing Lorenzo Carter, existing O'Shane Ximenez on the outside that you hope brings some pressure. Then you add in specifically Cam Brown, and then my buddy, my boy, Carter Coughlin, another really talented linebacker that I think the Giants found what you like to call the diamond in the rough or the steal of the draft for them. Last year it was Darius Slayton in the 5th. I think that the 7th round selection of Carter Coughlin is going to pay off huge dividends over his time with the New York Football Giants. But you flesh this out. But now Marcus Golden comes out, and yesterday the New York Giants elected to place the unrestricted free agent tender on Marcus Golden. Now, this is not typically utilized, and the reason being is this is a May 5th tender, which still allows Golden to negotiate a deal with another team and sign a contract and start his new career, continue his career somewhere else. The Giants would not receive any compensation if he signs elsewhere, but Golden would count towards the 2020 compensatory pick formula if he signs with another team. So does it make it more likely that Golden is back? That I don't know about, right? Because it doesn't really impact the other team who maybe signs him. It does help us out. We're not going to, we don't get no initial benefits from it, but then that means down the road, 2021, we could be talking about a compensatory pick. We've highlighted before the Leonard Williams situation. if he were to play out this free agency contract, and the franchise tag that we placed on him going in again, may take a year for us to receive it, but we could be in line to get a compensatory pick on his departure in a following free agency class. Ideally, I'd like to see the Giants sign into a long-term deal. I think it validates the trade that Gettleman made, and I really do believe in him as being a valuable member to what this defensive front can do. But you are talking about just short-term, long-term, Gettleman and the Giants trying to line things up so that if Golden goes somewhere else, they can still get some value in an asset, even if it ends up being, 10 sacks, right? You could be talking about another third-round compensatory pick potentially for the Giants, and whether they do it like they did this year in the draft, where they don't move around the board a lot, or they package it up and try to target some key players as they head into the next off season. Now, if Golden were to remain unsigned past July 22nd or the start of training camp, he could play for only the Giants this season. So the team would maintain the pass rusher's exclusive rights at 110% of his previous compensation package, which would be $5.225 million. So this at least sets the market for Golden to find a more lucrative offer out there on the free agency lines. What the Giants are basically saying is, if you want to go before July 22nd, fantastic. You can leave, and we can get ourselves a compensatory pick on your departure. If you're still here, we'll give you a little bit of a bump. And by the way, it was a pretty nice deal that we signed him on, the 1 year prove it kind of contract. We'll get you back for a little bit more. And it also says now, go out into free agency, talk to these teams, understanding you were looking to get upwards of $10 million. Obviously, the market wasn't there for that. But maybe you find a team now that says, well, if they're looking to give you a little over 5, we'll give you 6.5. We'll give you 7. And if that's the route that Golden wants to go, he can take advantage of that, sign a 2 or 3 year deal somewhere else, and again, kick in the value for the Giants. And, I would have liked to have seen maybe earlier on if the Giants wanted to bring him back to figure that out. But again, a 10-sack season for Marcus Golden. He obviously felt like he was going to hit free agency and maybe cash in after that prove-it deal. But at 29 years old, again, he came off an injury before he played last year. Obviously, from our perspective, there was the connection with James Bettcher. He's not there anymore. So now that thread gets a little bit tethered. And what's the new scheme and how would he fit into it? I'd still like him on the roster. And the last thing that we'll do here before we get out the door is we'll go ahead and bring up the New York Football Giants depth chart and just have a thought about where he'd be plugging in now if he were to come back to this team following free agency and following the draft. So when you go into the defensive side of this ball here, you're talking about that linebacker room. We highlighted this before. On the outside, Marcus Golden, with that now, he gets placed in there. They slot him here on, this is going by ESPN's unofficial depth chart. Giants won't set an official one until they get into the offseason. But if you put him out there ahead of Fackrell, now you've got a pretty nice 1-2 punch there. On the strong side, you're going to have Lorenzo Carter. So Fackrell could be the de facto depth behind both of those players there. And then, as we said, you have Carter Coughlin into the mix as well. So you have some nice players that you could really work off there from a depth perspective. Fackrell on the 1 year deal as well. So there's nothing to really say. They can't rotate or move these players around and find some value for them. So theoretically, if he came back, especially at that just north of $5 million contract, I'd be pretty excited about that. It would add another player into the room and obviously give the Giants some options. On the off chance that he's not there, then you're going to talk about the Cam Browns, the Carter Coughlins, and some of these younger players getting a chance to step up and prove themselves. If you want to have, a reliable player there, someone that you feel like what you're going to get from him. Obviously, getting Golden back in the building would be nice, but either way, I'm going to be okay with it. And at that price point, I'll take him back. I'll say, wow, we've created a lot of depth, a lot of situational value for these different players on the defensive side of the ball. And let's go ahead and move forward, see what they can do, see how this defensive front can occupy and lock in on the run game. What impact will McKinney have on the back end of this defense as well? And now we also have Bradbury in the mix. We drafted a couple of cornerbacks to go along with it. Holmes, obviously, a relatively high selection for the Giants in the draft as well. So this secondary, this defensive unit is going to see a lot of new players. You're going to see some turnover, and it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. Beyond that, we also mentioned with all of the post-draft signings the Giants made, there are going to have to be some cuts in order to accommodate all of the signings plus the post-draft signings, the draftees plus the post-draft signings, that is. And with that, we'll come back in, if not tomorrow, the following day, and just take a look at maybe if there's any news around who is getting released, and then where we think we can identify those, and what does it mean for some of the young players that were either drafted late last year or were, quote, priority free agents for the Giants. Are some of them already going to get shuffled out of the door or back down onto the practice squad potentially, depending on how the Giants evaluate the new talent that they've brought in this season? As we always say, follow us on social media at One Giant Podcast. Head over to iTunes, download, rate, and review. Subscribe to the One Giant Podcast. And as we continue to build the empire, that will be the One Giant Podcast brand. We thank you for joining along with us on this ride. And as Andy Makowitz would always like to say, let's go Big Blue. All right, so for those of you tuning in on YouTube, we're going to go ahead now and flesh out a couple more pieces here for us. That's going to be our intro. Normally, we would record this as well, so we'll go ahead and get that fired up here momentarily and set the table for what you'll be hearing if you weren't hearing it now, when you hear it then, when it's on the podcast. Adam Armbrecht flies solo on the episode today. We take a look at some free agency news on a familiar face, changing positions along the offensive line, and the potential exit of a veteran from the New York Football Giants. But before we do, let's reboot that one. This is the behind the scenes. Let's try that one again. It's an exciting solo episode for yours truly, where we will be covering a positional change for one of our rookie draftees, the familiar face across the offensive line that could be exiting from Big Blue, and a defensive friend we knew from last season possibly making a return. But before we do, let's drop that brass. Much better, much cleaner, friends. All right, that is going to do it on the inside look behind the podcast here. As I said, this is going to be something that's going to be evolving for YouTube. We just kicked this thing off. We haven't really promoted it a ton. We've seen a couple people sniffing around the channel here. So as we move forward, the idea is going to be to create some unique content over here that will basically be a companion piece to the podcast. So much in the way that the podcast episode we put out is probably going to be something in the range of about a 15 to 20 minute episode. Something over here on YouTube may extend itself out beyond that to 25 or 30 minutes. We'll expand on some of the topics, think about what our next shows may look like. That may not be the sole thing that we do here. We may also get a little bit more in depth on some of the prospects, some of these draftees, and how they're going to fit into the system as well. The other thing that we are going to want to do is try to engage you guys here. So if you want to reach out to us, you can send an email to onegiantpodcast@gmail.com. If you have a question or curiosity about the draft, about the upcoming season, about some positional players, or you have a hot take or opinion, send it over to us. Make sure in the subject line, go ahead and put YouTube question, and then we will come back in here, address those questions directly to you, give you a shout out, and hopefully continue to expand the conversation around all things New York Football Giants. That being the case, I have been Adam Armbrecht. I thank you for checking in with us. We will be back soon, talking all things Big Blue.